Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Jeremy Nichols. I'm the director of the NTT Security Holdings Global Threat Intelligence Center. I've been with the company actually 17 years next week, I believe, September 18th. And I've been involved with the production of our annual threat report every year. This is actually the 10th year we put it out. So happy to present to you today. As Marcus mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for questions, but certainly feel free to use the Q&A to ask anything as we're going through.
Yeah, great that you have this. I didn't realize it's actually 17 years. That's a really long time. Yes. Wow.
Yeah, it just hit me when I looked at the date. It started as September 18th, 2006. So been a while.
Impressive. Okay, let's kick it off. Thanks.
Great. All right, so just diving in before we start, just a quick agenda here. So today we'll focus on upfront just the methodology of how we get to the report, the data that we leverage, the other insights that we have as we begin to put this together every year. We'll take a look at the key findings that we highlighted in the report, which was for calendar year 2022. We'll also touch on some updates of what we've been seeing year to date here in 2023 as well. And then finally, just a recap of the recommendations that we have that we had in the report and how those are applying throughout this year. One note, there is quite a bit of extra detail on each of the slides from the report. I did try to highlight kind of the key points. So just for the sake of time, we won't dive into everything on each of the slides, but we'll call out the important pieces. And then again, there's the Q&A, excuse me, the Q&A feature, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So for data analysis, the methodology. So where does the data come from? Where do we get our insights? How do we bring that all together? So the number one piece that we've got from a data perspective is all of the attack and the log and the alert and the incident data. That's from our MSS platforms, MDR platforms, consulting engagements, essentially all of the customer data that's contributing to our reporting. We also have some vulnerability and exploitation trends that we've incorporated. A lot of that is, CVSS, CVE announcements and things of those natures, as well as the exploits we're seeing against our customer base. We have some insights that come just directly from our threat intelligence platform, from all of the structured intelligence we've brought in over the course of 2022. There's some ransomware insights that we've tied in. A lot of that is from the double extortion or the shame sites that the ransomware actors are hosting, trying to essentially bully the victims into paying the ransom, as well as some public reporting. There are certainly some groups that don't leverage that double extortion technique, so we tie that in. And then certainly again going back to our incident data, if we have any incidents for our customers with ransomware, that's incorporated as well. We have some insights that come from our kind of unique vantage point as NTT is a tier 1 internet service provider, the backbone data that we get there. The collaboration and sharing we have across the NTT teams and the different operating companies. So not just our SOC insights that they have from being on the ground all day, every day. We also have the CERT team and the CSERT teams across NTT that share data and intelligence that they're seeing either targeting NTT or targeting the wider customer base we have, not necessarily just the security customers. And then finally, the other aspect is the insights and collaboration that come from our partner and alliance network. That's a pretty key piece for us, being members of some of the intelligence sharing communities, as well as collaborating with law enforcement on some of the disruption efforts that you hear about for the large malware, the large botnet infrastructure. And that's really key for us at NTT, not just protecting our customers and protecting NTT assets, but also securing a safer future overall. So with that, we'll dive into the key findings. As we do every year, we take a look at the most attacked sectors, the most attacked geographies, and put together some quick insights there. This year's particular eye towards critical infrastructure and supply chain, as we've seen the past few years. With the continued shift towards cloud and SaaS, we also focused on that a little bit more as we saw an increase in that area more than we've had in years past. As always, we look at the different categories and try to deep dive those to see if there's any new trends that are emerging or anything that's worth calling out as far as the breakout of the different attack types against organizations. We dive into the ever-evolving malware and ransomware landscape, and then provide some vulnerability insights. We also focused a little this year on the ransomware trends and the continued evolution there, as well as kind of that bleed over between the cyber realm and the real world. We've started to see a little more acceleration in that realm where actual cyber incidents are having a much bigger real world impact than they've had in the past, as well as local and state and national governments' response to those through legislation or establishing new agencies to try to combat that. So with that, diving in, the number one, or the first key finding here was the most attacked sectors, as we highlighted. Within the report, you can see we continue to see really the targeting those high value industries within the critical infrastructure and supply chain sectors. So similar to last year, we had technology, manufacturing, and transport and distribution in the top three. Those do make up obviously key pieces of that supply chain or critical infrastructure for organizations and for countries. And that's similar to the ransomware trends we had this past year as well. In 2022, I believe manufacturing, IT, energy, and the transportation industries were all within the top 10 or 12 targeted from a ransomware perspective, and they made up over 30% of the victims. So that corresponds pretty closely with the volume we're seeing against just our customer base and the attacks that they're facing. The other one that we saw a big jump with this year was with the public sector. That actually jumped, it was not in the top 5 last year, it jumped up to number 4 this year. And that was also within the top 10 in ransomware victims that we're tracking as well. So what we're seeing against our customer base is pretty similar to a lot of the public reporting and some of what we're seeing from a ransomware perspective, really going after those high value targets that can cause pretty big disruption, or maybe more likely to pay because they need to get operations back up and running very quickly. So number 2 finding here, again, as I mentioned, we focused a little more on the cloud and SaaS-based attacks that we observed last year. A lot of this was influenced by some of this high-profile providers announcing vulnerabilities last year. And then the ease of incorporating the attacks and exploits into malware and botnets, which we'll talk a bit in the web application findings as well. Excuse me. But the value of this, this style of attack is definitely key, right? We saw that with just in 2023 with the CLOP, the MOVE IT attacks, the 0 days there, as well as the O365 breach that was just announced in the past couple months that actually sounds like it dates back several years. But the ability to get in, if you can get in through, cloud or SaaS-based providers, it really gives the attacker, much wider target base than just going after one organization or one industry by itself, right? So it gives you typically, one or minimal hop access to get to other cloud services, other tenants, or the entire customer base of that vendor or that SaaS provider, right? So very, very high value to an attacker to go after these, this type of vulnerability or of application. So we saw that this past year, especially with WordPress and some of the Apache products, the cloud-hosted products. As I mentioned, critical vulnerabilities announced last year in things like Jira, Confluence, and Bitbucket. That definitely drove them to the top of the list. We also see the continuation of attacks, things like Log4j that was announced at the end of 2021, that continued obviously into this year and drove some of that up as well. Then shifting towards the web application attacks, just kind of a layer deeper than the overall cloud and SaaS. We dug into this a little bit more, and really I think the keynote here is it's not just the 0 days or the advanced threat actors that we need to focus our protections on, right? Obviously, those are key. We need to make sure we're protecting our organizations against them. But you can see what we highlighted here with just the consistency of attacks across regions is very indiscriminate. A lot of the attackers are going to target an organization with a very specific goal in mind, a very specific approach to how they're going after that. But in terms of just malware and botnets that are constantly scanning, constantly attacking, those don't care what organizations they're going to compromise, right? These exploits are being tied into the malware, into the botnets, and they're targeting any online connected device. So we took a layer deeper on some of the web application attacks, and we looked at content management systems and PHP-based web applications. And what we could see here is that WordPress was the #1 attacked across the board, regardless of region. even though the majority of publicly exposed WordPress sites are actually based in North America. So it doesn't matter where you're at. If you're hosting one of these, it is going to be targeted regardless of your industry, regardless of your geography. Excuse me. And we saw that really kind of accelerate. I think we've seen this for a while with Mirai, Mozy, some of the botnets. They're typically incorporating new exploits quickly. And many of those are exploiting 50 to 75 different vulnerabilities. So again, it doesn't matter if you've got that exposure, if you've got that weakness, it's going to be attacked one way or another. And this really highlights the need for your attack surface management, right? Understanding what you have, understanding what's out there, what's exposed, and making sure it's up to date, making sure it's passed. And I saw a note pop in about the color. I do apologize about that. It looks better on my screen, but it sounds like it might be a little hard to read. The text that is highlighted is the notes I'm speaking through. So hopefully that helps at least get to those points. But definitely thank you for the feedback. All right. And then jumping into malware, from the malware perspective, we continue to see Trojans really lead the pack. That's been consistent for several years. We do have, banking Trojans and remote access Trojans broken out here, both falling in with the top 5. That may be a little confusing because obviously most malware at this point leverages, multiple different attack vectors, has multiple different TTPs that they're going after. So this is probably not as clear as it could be, since most malware is multifaceted and actually probably falls in 2 or 3 of these different classifications. But I think the important note is again, obviously Trojans are the key piece. We did see miners rise back up into the top 2 this past year. That was mostly tied to XMRig jumping back up, where we saw kind of a lull with that in 2021. And then obviously ransomware is key, and I think on the front of everybody's mind, which we'll touch on a little more here in a little bit. But I think the big note here with the evolution of malware and the ability for malware to go after multiple different attack vectors, it's less important to focus on the specific malware and more important to look at what are those actual tactics and techniques that are being taken advantage of, and what are the most popular ones being used across the spectrum, right? So instead of focusing on, we know these 3 pieces of malware specifically target our sector, it's important to note what's the commonality across those. And then looking at your environment, your protections, your hunting maturity, make sure you've actually got coverage for those specific techniques. So align with something like MITRE ATT&CK, make sure you've got that kind of mapped out from here's my monitoring, here's my prevention, here's my detection, and here's where my hunting maturity sits at. Identify any weak spots or any gaps and make sure those are being filled. And then finally, with the vulnerability spotlight, I think this one kind of falls into the obviously category, right? Attackers are going to go after critical and high impact vulnerabilities because they have a major impact or they're very easy to exploit. But it is a kind of an important reminder for us that patch management and that attack surface awareness is absolutely key, because I think the flip side of that is we say, yeah, we know these are going to be attacks. Okay, well then we should be patching them, right? But we still see a lot of exposure to some of these high profile vulnerabilities. So we're still seeing much more success with these than we should be, if the understanding is that yes, these need patched first, right? Typically, these have a lower complexity to exploit. So a lot of these exploits are being tied into malware very quickly, as we noted on the WordPress side, right? The attackers are going to continue to go with what works. And it's simply working more often than it should. So really important to assess your environment. I think different ways to kind of prioritize vulnerabilities. We noted in the report that several of the top vulnerabilities, I think 3 of the top 5 and 7 of the top 10, were all in the U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency as known exploited, right? They know these are out there. They know they're actively being exploited in the wild. And we're seeing those target, not just our customers, but plenty of public reporting on that as well. So something to consider in terms of the patch management program, right? I know certainly we need to test patches. We need to make sure everything works specifically for our environments, but that may help organizations kind of prioritize what they need to get patched first, what they need to test quicker and get rolled out to production much faster. So just a different way to help assist that vulnerability program to make sure the the most impactful things are being patched first and foremost. All right. So in diving in on the ransomware side, so we looked at when we were evaluating not just the malware but the ransomware, we looked at kind of the longevity of the different ransomware groups and the evolution of the ransomware itself. So we broke them out into a handful of categories, as you can see here. You know, which ones popped up last year, which ones were multi-year operations that were very successful last year, which ones were phased out, whether that was law enforcement disruption or they disbanded or they, you know, essentially rebranded as a new group or split off into a new group. And then which ones, what we kind of called staying power, right? They've been active for 3 or more years. They weren't as successful as last year as the ones we listed in the Survive and Profit, but they were around, they were still claiming victims. Excuse me. And of the 15 we listed here, or excuse me, of the 15 that are still active last year, 12 of those are still active this year and have claimed victims just within the past month or two, with a couple others. You know, Hive and Vice Society had claimed victims earlier in the year, but have phased out either through disruption like Hive or through a little bit more of a breakout of the group with Vice. And with the, you know, kind of the availability of initial access brokers, ransomware as a service, and the affiliate programs, a lot of these groups are continuing to be active, but just shifting their focus to building or maintaining their malware and adding capabilities rather than having to do, you know, the end-to-end of identify their target, exploit, deliver the ransomware, and deal with, you know, getting the ransom paid. In some cases, they're simply running that affiliate program. The affiliates sign up, they get a portion of that revenue for any of the ransoms that are paid. And again, their focus is just on running the ransomware, building the ransomware, and evolving it. This past year, we also saw groups, I guess, kind of steep to new lows and into this year as well. With one of the recent healthcare breaches, the ransomware group actually offered the individual patients to pay a ransom to get their individual records removed from that data disclosure. So, you know, quite frankly, pretty disgusting behavior there. We've also seen cybercrime groups start to threaten their victims with being, you know, essentially fined through compliance standards like GDPR and data protection acts if they don't pay the ransom, right? If you don't pay the ransom, we're going to essentially put you on blast that you've violated GDPR. And then even I think some of the groups tend to have rules or avoid certain organizations, but I think just was it yesterday or the day before, we saw BNLN target the Save the Children, right? It's just typically those are kind of off limits, right? Hospitals and nonprofits and things like that. But so far this year, we've seen a lot more targeting and less, you know, not encrypting that data. They're still going through with some of those attacks. And I think the big thing, this is certainly not changing anytime soon. I think just looking at the numbers earlier this week, we've got almost 1,000 more victims that we're tracking that have been disclosed this year than all of 2022. And we've still got, you know, essentially 3.5 months to go. So we did start putting out infographics on this that are available on the website as well. Each quarter, we do a couple different sectors with a specific focus on the ransomware and which ransomware has actually been the most successful against those sectors. So definitely take a look at those to keep up to date on what we're seeing throughout the year. All right. And then as I noted early, we have started to see more bleed over. And I do apologize. This slide actually does stand out quite a bit to me as well. So I'll make sure to touch on each of the ones I have highlighted. But we have started to see much more bleed over where cyber incidents are starting to have more of an impact on, you know, citizens or cities or even small regions and countries. Whereas typically in the past, an incident or a breach was isolated to that organization, right? We're starting to see with, you know, Costa Rica had a ransomware incident, actually several ransomware incidents that essentially took a lot of government services offline for months. We've seen, you know, MSPs and providers targeted that are impacting, in this case, you know, essentially 911 or emergency services, disruption of payment, disruption of, you know, fuel and things like that that are absolutely critical to different, you know, to the citizens, to the countries and the regions. And then the flip side of that is we've started to see countries and local governments try to pass further legislation to prevent things within the cyber realm, essentially, right? So Sweden established an agency to combat misinformation. We've seen additional organizations like the US FCC banning software such as Kaspersky. And this year we've seen a lot of that with some of the, Chat GPT and generative AI as well, with entire countries looking to ban that until there's been, more work in that area, more studies in that area of really the power of that. And then we've also seen, just from a geopolitical perspective, Albania sever relations with Iran over a cyber attack. So starting to see that really blend more, where it's no longer that there's an incident, one organization's impacted and that's it. It's really starting to have much more widespread impact. So with all that said, what are the recommendations, right? What can we do individually or for our organizations to help protect against those? I think number one and strongest recommendation we had was enable, proper multi-factor authentication. This is typically available in most tools. It's generally free included, but credential-based attacks are always one of the top 3 entry points. So certainly not 100% protection against that, but a very easy way to thwart a lot of the basic attacks, brute force attacks, things like that. As we highlighted on the malware side, obviously it's important to keep an eye on the actors in the malware that are targeting your organization or your sector and industry. But really, we need to understand the TTPs that malware is leveraging and make sure we're protecting against those TTPs rather than just the specific malware, right? Because there are still going to always be those opportunistic threats. There's going to be the malware and botnets that are continually scanning, continually trying to exploit anybody and everybody that they can reach, right? So we've got to make sure we're protecting against the key entry points as opposed to the specific malware, specific IOCs of that malware. It's really the behavior we need to make sure we're protected against.
Jeremy, just TTPs, tactics.
Yeah, sorry, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Basically, the behavior of those actors, the behavior of that malware. So rather than saying, we know this IP is a C2 for this malware, certainly we need to protect against that. But from staying in front of that rather than responding to the individual IOCs, we need to make sure we're actually protecting against those tactics and techniques that the malware is using, that the actors are using to target. Number 3 there, the review and test continuously, again, kind of highlighted from the vulnerability side, but we need proper patch management. We need attack surface awareness. We need to understand, what's going to target us, make sure we're protected against that, and make sure we don't set it and trust that, we do have a policy for that. It'll work if we run into that situation, right? That stuff needs to be tested. We need to stay on top of it. Definitely try to leverage standards there, such as CVSS or any intelligence insights into the CVEs that are out there that are being incorporated, that are being actively exploited in the wild. It's really key to make sure we have protections against those and we're prioritizing the right things. Number 4, disable any unused plugins or services. This really goes back on the WordPress side. We saw a lot of attacks against add-ons and plugins that typically should never be seen in production, right? So PHP unit for unit testing, that making it through, from a development testing, not shutting it off and that rolling into production, right? It's really important to make sure you've got proper validation between those dev, test, QA environments and production. Make sure anything that's not used is disabled and ideally uninstalled entirely. Like if it's not going to be used or it's never used, just remove it. If you can't remove it, shut it off if it's not being used publicly. And then the final one there, just make sure assess third-party vendors and supply chain security. Consider going after that in the evaluation or the RFP process, throughout setup, throughout connectivity, throughout any integration, right? Make sure you're on top of assessing that. Make sure there's no unnecessary or extraneous pieces in play that could open you up to further security weaknesses because of the vendor or because of how that that collaboration with the vendor is set up. And then finally, just some final thoughts we had put out in the report, kind of getting into 2023. First one there, third-party vendors and APIs. those are definitely, as you know, as we kind of noted with Microsoft and Move It, right? They're a very appealing target. You could typically get multiple victims or pivot to additional, services, additional tenants, and things like that. A lot of that software for the third-party vendors and API is typically shared amongst several companies within the same industry, right? So pick a certain software and you can target several financial organizations. Pick a certain software to target and you could target several manufacturing organizations, right? So those are always going to be very high value and typically allow the attacker, as mentioned, one and two hop access to other services, other tenants. The AI evolution, we're starting to see some standards and protection against that misuse, but they can certainly still be abused and worked around. We've also seen company data leaks because of GPT, where proprietary information was actually leaked through somebody working with the chatbot to try to write a blog or write something else, right? There's also the evolution there on the dark web side is things like Dark-Bart, are essentially criminal chatbots that the same functionality of Google Bard, but they're specifically meant to write exploits or specifically meant to write malware. And then finally, just the continuation of cyber attacks having that impact on international relations, and not just state-sponsored or state nexus actors, but retaliatory attacks, hacktivists, things like that. We're seeing a lot of that. In Europe, we've seen a lot of DDoS attacks just as a result of something someone had said, right? And seeing airports targeted, seeing different organizations targeted, just for certain country or certain group to prove that they are mature and that they can actually do that, right? So we definitely see further impact on that as we continue through the year. All right, and with that, I will stop. I do apologize. I went a little longer than I hoped to, but we do have a few minutes here for any questions that have popped in.
You have all the possibility to activate your mic if you want to speak up, or you can enter that into the Q&A up in the top. Thank you, Jeremy. Very interesting. And if you want to read the report, you find it on our website, security.ntt, and just navigate to Insights and Reports, and you find it there. We will continue, as we said, to launch on a quarterly basis some highlights from our research team, from the GTIC team on which have updated data. Let's see if there are any questions. I'm not surprised. You don't get that much questions on these sessions.
Sure.
Okay. If no further questions, I thank you, Jeremy, for this one. And if you have any questions on NTT security and what services we provide for managing detection and response to those, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to support you all. So by that, I'm closing this webinar. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining.